Randy Sawyer's Milan flight got cancelled, so he drove through the night to surprise Debbie. Instead, he found his blind wife crawling across the patio tiles toward an outdoor faucet while Tony DeLuca laughed in his living room. Her walker lay sideways on the tiles like she'd collapsed trying to reach it. Tony was toasting something with champagne, completely unaware Randy was watching from the shadows. Debbie turned her sightless eyes toward his footsteps, confused, ashamed, desperate. 22 years building an empire in the underworld, and Randy had never seen betrayal this twisted. What a cancelled flight taught him about loyalty would remind everyone why some men are called ghosts, and how sometimes the people you trust most are the ones you should fear. 6 months earlier, Debbie had lost her sight completely. The doctors called it progressive optic neuropathy, degenerative, irreversible, started with blurred vision, ended with total darkness. Randy and Debbie had tried every specialist from Manhattan to Boston, spent $250,000 on treatments, experimental procedures, medications with names Randy couldn't pronounce. Nothing worked. At 41 years old, Randy's wife, brilliant, independent, the woman who'd convinced him to walk away from a life built on violence and fear, couldn't see her own reflection anymore. Couldn't read the books she loved, couldn't watch the sunrise over the sound from their bedroom window. Watching her struggle with simple tasks like finding the bathroom at night or reaching for a glass in the kitchen broke something in Randy he didn't know could break. The walker became her lifeline. Titanium frame, custom grip handles, cost $3,000 from a medical supply company in Queens. Debbie hated it, called it her mechanical jailer, but it kept her mobile, kept her safe, kept her from feeling completely helpless in the fortress Randy had built to protect her. Randy had built Sawyer Holdings from nothing. Started in 1985 with a single protection racket in Harlem. Turned it into legitimate real estate development, private equity investments, consulting firms that translated street economics into boardroom language. Their net worth sat comfortably at $47 million, most of it carefully laundered through decades of strategic acquisitions. Not bad for a kid who'd grown up in foster care in the Bronx. Their estate in Long Island wasn't a mansion, but it was substantial. 8 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 5,200 square feet sitting on 4 acres of manicured grounds behind iron gates and security cameras. They'd bought it in 2001 for $1.8 million. Today's market valued it north of $7 million. The mortgage had been paid off for a decade. Tony DeLuca, Randy's consigliere and closest friend for 18 years, had always been complicated. 52 years old, third-generation Italian-American, educated at Fordham Law before choosing Randy's world over legitimate practice. He'd bounced between legitimate consulting work and managing Randy's underground interests during the transition years. Nothing quite fit him the way the old life had. He'd handled every major negotiation, every delicate transition when Randy had started legitimizing operations in the late 90s. Married to a woman named Angela. Quiet, elegant, old money from Connecticut. They lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. Randy had helped them purchase. Visited every Sunday for dinner, usually bringing wine and stories about their art gallery investments. Seemed like a normal couple navigating the strange space between Randy's past and present. The first red flag came 4 weeks after Debbie's sight failed completely. Tony stopped by on a Wednesday afternoon while Randy was in Manhattan closing a commercial property deal in Midtown. When Randy got home, Debbie mentioned Tony had been asking questions about their living situation. "He's worried about us managing this big house," she said, settling into her reading chair with a sigh. Her fingers traced the braille book in her lap, a habit she'd developed, touching things constantly now to orient herself. Asked if we'd ever considered hiring full-time medical staff, maybe moving somewhere more accessible. Their house wasn't just accessible, it was fortress-level secure. Randy had spent 2 years after her diagnosis retrofitting everything. Textured flooring changes between rooms, voice-activated lighting systems, railings at exact heights, motion sensors that announced her location to his phone. Medical staff? Randy had laughed. "You're blind, not dying." But Tony's concern kept escalating. He started dropping by more frequently, always when Randy was out handling business. He'd find Debbie struggling with something, reaching for a glass in the kitchen, navigating the stairs to the second floor, finding her way to the garden, and suggest maybe it was time to consider professional care facilities. Angela joined the campaign 3 weeks later. She'd arrived with brochures about luxury assisted living communities, statistics about accident rates for the visually impaired in large homes, testimonies from families who'd made the difficult but necessary choice. "We just want what's best for both of you," she'd say, squeezing Debbie's hand with practiced sympathy. International Real Estate Symposium, worth potentially $15 million in new partnerships. Legitimate business. The kind Debbie had begged Randy to focus on when he'd promised to leave his old life behind. Randy had planned to stay through the weekend, maybe visit the galleries she'd always wanted to see before the darkness came, bring back photographs he could describe to her in detail. Then Alitalia Airlines decided fog in Milan was too risky for landing. They offered to rebook him for Monday, but something nagged at Randy. Call it instinct. Call it 22 years of reading people's intentions across poker tables and negotiation rooms where a wrong word meant a bullet. He rented an Audi A8 and drove 3 hours to a private airfield where a contact owed him a favor. 6 hours in a chartered Gulfstream. Then another hour in a hired car from Teterboro to Long Island through the pre-dawn darkness of Friday morning. Randy had called Debbie around 11 p.m. from the car to let her know he was coming home early. The phone rang 14 times before going to voicemail. Not unusual. She often couldn't find her phone now, relied on voice commands that didn't always work, took sleeping medication when the phantom lights in her ruined vision made sleep impossible. The iron gates opened smoothly on their sensors. Randy's keychain felt familiar in the electronic lock. The garage door opener worked perfectly. Everything seemed normal until he heard that laughter from inside the house. Not Debbie's laugh. Tony's. Deep, satisfied, the kind of laugh that comes from getting away with something. Randy had installed enough legitimate and illegitimate plumbing systems over 2 decades to read water pressure like a financial statement. Their estate ran on a private well with a commercial-grade pump system rated for 75 psi throughout the house. Every tap should flow strong and clear. The main control valve sat in a concrete housing near the property line, protected by a security lock only the utility company and Randy should have keys to. The lock was missing. The valve handle had been turned to the quarter-open position. Normal water pressure ran at 75 psi. Quarter open meant maybe 18 psi, enough to keep pipes from bursting, but not enough for comfortable living. Someone with detailed knowledge of utility systems had done this deliberately. Inside the house, Randy tested every faucet with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent decades examining evidence. Kitchen sink, weak dribble. Master bathroom, barely enough pressure to brush teeth. Guest bathrooms, same pathetic trickle. But the outdoor spigot, the one where he'd found Debbie kneeling like an animal in her torn blue gown, ran at full pressure. It was connected to a separate irrigation line that bypassed the main valve system. A line only someone with detailed knowledge of the estate's infrastructure would know existed. Someone who'd helped Randy design this property's security and utility systems years ago. Someone he'd trusted with literally everything. Through the open living room window, Tony's laugh got louder. Randy heard glasses clinking, heard voices he recognized. Marco, his accountant. Vincent, his investment advisor. Luca, Debbie's supposed nurse. Men who'd stood beside him through federal investigations and territory wars. Men who were celebrating something in his home while his blind wife crawled for water outside. Randy stood in the shadows of his own foyer, suitcase still in hand, leather jacket smelling like jet fuel and midnight, and felt something he hadn't felt in 22 years. The ghost of Harlem, waking up, cold, calculating, patient. Ready to remind everyone why some men never really retire, they just wait for the right reason to remember who they were. And as Randy watched Tony raise another champagne glass through the living room window, completely unaware he was being observed. Randy understood something with perfect crystalline clarity. This wasn't about business. This wasn't about money or territory or the usual betrayals that had defined his old world. This was about Debbie. About his blind wife crawling for water while men he'd called brothers laughed in the house he'd built to keep her safe. Before I continue with the story, click subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, because what happens next will prove that no betrayal burns colder than revenge served by a ghost, so subscribe not to miss it. Let's get back into the story. And that was the kind of betrayal that didn't get resolved in boardrooms or through lawyers or with carefully worded settlements. That got resolved the old way. The way the ghost of Harlem had always resolved things, with absolute, methodical, irreversible destruction. Tony's laughter echoed through the morning air, oblivious and cruel. Randy's hands flexed once, the only outward sign of the cold fury building inside him like pressure in a sealed chamber. Then he stepped deeper into the shadows and began to watch, to calculate, to plan. The ghost had come home, and ghosts, Randy knew, were very, very patient when it came to haunting the living. Randy moved from the shadows like a man who'd learned long ago that silence was more dangerous than noise. He crossed the patio in 4 strides, each step measured, controlled. Debbie's head turned toward the sound of his footsteps, her remaining senses hyper-aware in the way blindness taught, and her expression shifted from desperation to confusion to something that looked like relief mixed with shame. "Randy?" Her voice cracked, dry from dehydration. You're not supposed to be home until... I'm here now." He knelt beside her, his hands finding her arms gently, despite the rage building in his chest like a pressure valve about to blow. Her skin was cold, too cold for a woman who should have been sleeping comfortably in their climate-controlled home. "Debbie, what happened?" "I'm sorry." The words tumbled out automatically, reflexively, like she'd been practicing them. "I tried to wait. I tried to. But I was so thirsty. And no one would..." Her hands trembled against his chest as he lifted her. "They said doctor's orders. They said I wasn't supposed to..." "Shh." Randy cradled her against him, feeling how light she'd become, how fragile. When had she gotten this thin? He'd only been gone 5 days. "Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." But Debbie kept apologizing anyway, kept whispering sorry against his shoulder as he carried her toward the house, her torn blue gown trailing behind them like evidence at a crime scene. Through the living room window, the laughter died. The celebration inside ended the moment Randy stepped through the French doors. 4 men stood frozen in his living room like actors caught mid-performance. Marco held a wine glass halfway to his lips. Vincent had been reaching for the cheese board. Luca, Debbie's supposed nurse, stood by the fireplace looking pale and trapped. And Tony DeLuca, consigliere, oldest friend, the man Randy had trusted with everything, stood at the head of the dining table with a champagne bottle in one hand and a smile that died the second he saw Randy. "Randy!" Tony's recovery was smooth, practiced. The smile reconstructed itself with professional precision. "We didn't expect you until Sunday. The flight got canceled." Randy's voice was flat, empty. He didn't look at Tony, didn't acknowledge the others, just carried Debbie through the living room toward the stairs, moving past men who'd suddenly become very interested in their shoes. "Is Debbie okay?" Tony asked, concern bleeding into his tone like ink and water. "We were just celebrating something?" Randy paused at the bottom of the staircase, finally turning to look at his consigliere. "What were you celebrating, Tony?" Silence. The kind that filled rooms when guilty men tried to manufacture innocence. Just, you know, Friday night. Thought we'd keep Debbie company while you were away." Tony gestured at the spread on the dining table with forced casualness. Didn't want her feeling alone in this big house. Randy's eyes moved to the table. Prime rib, still steaming. Roasted vegetables glistening with butter. A cheese board worth more than most people's weekly groceries. 3 bottles of wine, 2 empty, 1 half drunk. Crystal glasses catching lamplight, a feast for 4 men. And by the sink, barely visible from this angle, a single bowl. Porridge, cold, untouched. I see. Randy's grip on Debbie tightened slightly. She'd gone quiet against his shoulder, her breathing shallow, her body rigid with something that felt like fear. Very thoughtful. He carried her upstairs without another word. Debbie's bedroom, their bedroom, though Randy had taken to calling it hers since the blindness made her need familiarity more than companionship, looked untouched. Bed made with hospital corners, nightstand organized with braille precision, everything exactly where she'd left it. Except the water pitcher on her nightstand was empty, and the basket where Randy kept protein bars for her midnight snacks sat bare. He laid her gently on the bed, smoothing her hair back from her face. Up close, in proper light, she looked worse than he'd thought. Dark circles under her sightless eyes, cheekbones too prominent, lips cracked from dehydration. "When did you last eat?" Randy asked quietly. Debbie's hands found his face, her fingers tracing his features the way she'd learned to see. "Tuesday, I think. Maybe Monday night. I lose track of the days when you're gone." Her voice was small, apologetic. "Luca said the doctor changed my diet. Said I needed to fast before new treatments. Said—" "What doctor?" Randy caught her hands gently. "Dr. Morrison didn't mention any diet changes when I spoke to him before I left. A new one. Dr. Chen, I think Luca called him. He came by Wednesday, did some tests." Debbie's brow furrowed. "He had a strange accent, and he didn't examine me the way doctors usually do, just asked questions. About you, mostly. About the house. About—" Randy's blood went cold. "About our finances?" Maybe? I don't remember. I was so tired." Her hands fell to her lap, trembling. "Randy, I'm sorry. I should have called you." "But they said—" "Stop apologizing." Randy stood, anger crystallizing into something sharp and purposeful. "You did nothing wrong. Do you understand me? Nothing." He filled the water pitcher from the bathroom tap, the pressure weak, barely a trickle, and helped Debbie drink. She gulped it desperately, water spilling down her chin, her hands shaking so badly he had to steady the glass. When she finally fell asleep, exhaustion claiming her the moment her head hit the pillow, Randy stood watching her for a long moment, memorizing the way her chest rose and fell, the way her hands curled against the pillow like a child's, the woman he'd left the streets for, the reason he'd buried the ghost of Harlem and tried to become someone worthy of her love. Someone had starved her, dehydrated her, humiliated her in her own home. And Randy was going to find out exactly who. The house was quieter when Randy descended the stairs. The celebration had scattered like roaches when light hit. Marco and Vincent were gone, probably slipped out the back while Randy was upstairs. Smart. Self-preservation always was their strongest trait. But Tony remained. He stood by the living room window, looking out at the dawn breaking over the sound, whiskey in hand. The champagne had been replaced with something darker, more appropriate for whatever conversation he thought was coming. "How is she?" Tony asked without turning. Randy didn't answer. He moved through his own living room like a stranger, seeing it with fresh eyes, seeing what he'd missed while building his legitimate empire, while trusting the wrong people with the right access. The dining table still held the remains of their feast. Randy stopped there, looking at the spread. Prime rib, 12-ounce cuts, cooked perfectly rare. His favorite cut from his favorite steakhouse in Manhattan, the one that didn't deliver unless you were on a very short list. His fingers traced the edge of a plate, still warm. Then he walked to the sink, looked at the single bowl of porridge. Congealed. Gray. The kind of institutional food that came from cutting costs, not caring for someone. His hand clenched around the counter's edge. "Randy," Tony started. "Who's Dr. Chen?" The question cut through whatever speech Tony had been preparing. Randy saw it in the way his consigliere's shoulders stiffened, the way his grip tightened on the whiskey glass. "The specialist we hired for Debbie. You said to spare no expense on her treatment. So I know every specialist within 200 miles of this house." Randy turned slowly, his voice perfectly level. "Dr. Morrison coordinates her care. I speak to him personally twice a week. He's never mentioned anyone named Chen." Tony's smile was placating, smooth. The same smile he'd used in 100 negotiations. "It was a last-minute consultation. Morrison recommended him. I have the paperwork somewhere. Show me." "What?" "The paperwork. Show me. Now." Silence stretched between them like wire pulled taut. Tony set down his whiskey glass with exaggerated care. "Randy, I understand you're upset. Coming home and finding Debbie like that, it looks bad. But there's a reasonable explanation for everything. The diet restrictions, the water pressure issues." "You know about the water pressure." It wasn't a question. Randy saw the answer in the microsecond Tony's expression slipped before recovering. "The whole house has been having issues," Tony said. "I called a plumber Tuesday. He said something about the main valve. The main valve that's locked in a security box only I have keys to." Another beat of silence. Randy took a step forward, then another, moving with the controlled precision of a man who'd spent decades teaching people to fear the space he occupied. "There were 4 of you here tonight," Randy said quietly, "eating prime rib and drinking champagne in my house, while my blind wife crawled across the patio for water." He stopped 3 feet from Tony, close enough to see the sweat forming on his consigliere's upper lip. "What were you celebrating, Tony?" "Nothing. It was just dinner, with my accountant and my investment advisor." Randy's voice never rose, never hardened, just stayed perfectly, terrifyingly level. "And Debbie's nurse, the one who told her she couldn't eat, the one who said it was doctor's orders." He tilted his head slightly. "What orders, Tony? Whose orders?" Tony's hand moved toward his jacket, reflex, defensive, and Randy's hand shot out, catching his wrist before it reached whatever Tony kept in his inside pocket. "Don't!" Randy's grip was iron. "Don't insult me by pretending you need protection in my own house." For 5 seconds, they stood frozen. 2 men who'd built an empire together, who'd survived federal investigations and gang wars, and the transition from street crime to legitimate business. Brothers, once. Strangers now. Randy released Tony's wrist and stepped back. "Get out," he said quietly. "Randy, listen. Get out!" Randy's voice stayed level, but something in his eyes, something cold and calculating that had been sleeping for 22 years, made Tony stop talking. "Take Marco and Vincent and Luca and anyone else who was here tonight. And don't come back until I call you." "You're making a mistake." "The mistake was mine." Randy turned away, looking at the porridge bowl in the sink, at the evidence of systematic cruelty dressed up as medical necessity. "I trusted the wrong people, but that's a mistake I only make once." He heard Tony leave, the front door closing softly, expensive shoes on the driveway, a car engine starting. Heard the iron gates open and close, then silence. Randy stood alone in his living room, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration he hadn't been invited to, and felt the old instincts waking up, the ones that had kept him alive through 1,000 betrayals, the ones that knew how to read loyalty and identify rot. His men were still out there, the ones who'd stood beside him in Harlem, who'd followed him into legitimate business because he'd asked them to, not because they had to. Frankie Vance, Marcus Stone, Jimmy Woo, men who understood the difference between business and betrayal. But Tony? Marco? Vincent? Luca? Rot. All of them. Randy poured himself a whiskey, Tony's whiskey, left behind on the table, and looked at his reflection in the living room window. Dawn was breaking properly now, painting the sound in shades of gold and red. He looked older than he remembered, softer. The face of a man who'd tried to leave violence behind. But in the glass, backlit by sunrise, Randy saw something else. Someone else. The ghost of Harlem, staring back. Cold. Patient. Absolutely certain. And Randy realized something with perfect clarity. You don't clean betrayal. You don't negotiate with it, or rehabilitate it, or give it second chances. You burn it out, root and branch, until nothing remains but ash and the memory of why you don't betray the ghost of Harlem. Randy raised the whiskey glass to his reflection. "Welcome home," he whispered. Then he drank and began to plan. Debbie woke at noon, disoriented and trembling. Randy sat in the chair beside her bed where he'd been for the past 6 hours, watching her sleep the way a man watches something precious he thought he'd lost. Her eyes opened but didn't focus, couldn't focus, just stared at the ceiling with that particular emptiness that still broke something in him every time he saw it. "Randy?" Her voice was hoarse, confused. "You're still here? Where else would I be?" He moved to the bed, taking her hand. Her fingers were cold despite the blankets he'd piled on her. "How do you feel?" "Tired, thirsty, I—" She paused, her free hand moving to her stomach. "Hungry. God, I'm so hungry." "When did you last eat? Really eat, not just—" Randy gestured at the bowl of untouched porridge still sitting on the nightstand, then remembered she couldn't see the gesture. "Not just whatever Luca was bringing you." Debbie's brow furrowed in concentration. Her fingers traced patterns on the blanket, a habit she'd developed when trying to remember things. Like her hands could read memories the way they read Braille. "Tuesday morning," she finally said. "I think. Luca brought oatmeal. Plain, no sugar, no fruit. He said the new doctor, Dr. Chen, ordered a restricted diet before treatments." Her voice grew smaller. "Then Tuesday night he said I needed to fast. That the treatments required an empty stomach. That it was just for 48 hours. Randy's jaw tightened. "Today is Friday." "Friday?" Debbie's hand flew to her mouth. "But that's 3 days. Randy, that can't be right. I would have—" "You were thirsty enough to crawl across the patio for water." Randy kept his voice level, controlled, but his free hand clenched into a fist against his thigh. "From an outdoor faucet, while 4 men ate prime rib in our living room." Debbie went very still, then quietly. "They were here? In the house? Celebrating something, I don't know what yet." Randy stood, rage building behind his calm exterior like water behind a dam. "But I'm going to find out, starting with Luca." "Randy, please." Debbie reached for him, her hand finding his arm. Don't do anything you'll regret. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe—" "There's no misunderstanding in starving a blind woman for 3 days." Randy covered her hand with his, gentle despite the fury coursing through him. "But I'm not going to do anything stupid. I just want answers." He could feel her wanting to believe him. Wanting to believe the man she'd convinced to leave the streets behind was still that man, still capable of handling betrayal without violence. Randy wasn't sure he believed it himself anymore. "I'll bring you food," he said. "Real food. Then we're calling Dr. Morrison, the real one." Randy found Luca in the kitchen, preparing to leave. The nurse, if that's what he actually was, had changed out of his scrubs into street clothes, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He froze when Randy entered, his face going pale in a way that confirmed every suspicion. "Mr. Sawyer," Luca's voice cracked. I wasn't expecting. Where are you going?" "Just I was just finishing my shift. I usually leave around noon on Fridays. You were leaving without checking on your patient. Randy moved deeper into the kitchen, his presence filling the space in a way that made Luca back up against the counter. The blind woman you're being paid to care for, the one who hasn't eaten in 3 days. She was fasting. Doctor's orders. I was following. What doctor? Randy's voice stayed quiet, dangerously quiet. What's Dr. Chen's full name? His license number? Where's his practice? Luca's mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish drowning in air. You don't know, Randy said. Because there is no Dr. Chen, is there? Mr. DeLuca said. Luca stopped, realizing his mistake too late. Randy's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Luca press harder against the counter, like he could merge with the granite if he tried hard enough. Tony gave you orders to starve my wife. Not starve. Just restricted diet. For her treatments. He said you authorized it. That you were coordinating everything through him while you were traveling. I authorized nothing. Randy took another step forward. And there are no treatments scheduled. Dr. Morrison told me himself, there's nothing more we can do for her vision. We're managing symptoms, not treating causes. He tilted his head. So why would Tony tell you to stop feeding her? Luca's hands shook. I was just following orders. Whose orders? Tony's or the doctor's? Tony's. The admission came out broken, desperate. Mr. DeLuca said, he said it was temporary, that you knew about it, that Mrs. Sawyer needed to learn. He stopped again, this time because Randy's hand had shot out and gripped the counter beside him hard enough to make the granite creak. Learn what? Randy's voice was silk wrapped around steel. I don't know. I swear I don't know. Luca was shaking now, full body tremors. He just said to follow the diet plan he gave me. No solid food after Tuesday, limited water, keep her in her room. Don't let her wander. He said she was getting too comfortable, that she needed to understand her situation. Randy stared at Luca for a long moment, then he stepped back, releasing the counter. Get out. Mr. Sawyer, get out of my house, now. And if I ever see you near my wife again, they'll need dental records to identify you. Randy's voice never rose, never hardened, just stayed perfectly, terrifyingly calm. Do you understand? Luca grabbed his duffel bag and ran. Randy listened to the front door slam, the car engine start, the tires squeal on the driveway. Then he turned to the kitchen and began his investigation. The Sub-Zero refrigerator was a monument to abundance. Prime cuts of beef, organic vegetables, imported cheeses, fresh fruit arranged like art. Enough food to feed a family for a week. Randy pulled items out methodically, checking each one. Every single package had a label, for guests only. Not printed labels. Handwritten. In Tony's distinctive block lettering. Randy's hands stilled on a package of salmon. Tony had labeled the food in Randy's own house like it was a hotel kitchen. Had divided the supplies between guests, Tony and his co-conspirators, and Debbie, who apparently wasn't worthy of fresh food. He opened the crisper drawer marked with a piece of tape, Mrs. Sawyer, dietary restrictions. Inside, 3 containers of plain oatmeal, now fuzzy with mold. A bowl of broth, separated and rancid. A single apple, brown and shriveled. Food that had been prepared and forgotten, left to rot while men ate prime rib, 10 feet away. Randy closed the drawer carefully. Opened the freezer. Found it packed with premium cuts, gourmet meals, desserts from that French bakery Tony loved. And in the back, behind everything else, a single frozen meal marked low sodium, Mrs. S. It was from 3 weeks ago, still frozen, never heated, never served. Mr. Sawyer? Randy turned to find Maria, their housekeeper, standing in the kitchen doorway. She looked terrified, her hands twisting in her apron. How long? Randy asked quietly. Sir? How long has my wife been eating like this? Maria's eyes filled with tears. I. We were told not to. Mr. DeLuca said you'd given orders, that Mrs. Sawyer's diet was restricted, that we weren't to prepare anything for her without his approval. The words tumbled out fast, desperate. We thought. We thought you knew. We thought it was medical. Randy looked at this woman who'd worked for them for 8 years, who'd cleaned their home, prepared their meals, smiled at Debbie and asked about her books and her garden, who'd stood by and watched her starve because a man with authority said it was allowed. Did you ask her? Randy's voice was soft. Did you ask Debbie if she was hungry? If she needed anything? Maria's sob answered before her words could. I tried once, on Wednesday. I brought her soup, just chicken soup, nothing fancy. And Luca caught me. He said I was jeopardizing her treatment, that you'd fire me if I interfered. She wiped her eyes. I'm so sorry. I should have called you. But Mr. DeLuca said, everyone says Tony told them. Randy turned back to the refrigerator, staring at the abundance behind glass. And everyone believed him, because I was stupid enough to give him access to my home, my staff, my wife. He closed the refrigerator door and walked past Maria without another word. Randy spent the afternoon feeding Debbie. Not quickly, not with the abundant feast sitting in the kitchen. Her stomach couldn't handle that after 3 days of nothing. Instead, he made broth, real chicken broth, not the institutional crap in the crisper, and fed it to her 1 spoonful at a time. She cried while she ate. Quiet tears that tracked down her cheeks while she swallowed like someone who'd forgotten what food tasted like. I'm sorry, she whispered between spoonfuls. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. I should have. Stop. Randy wiped her tears with his thumb. You trusted people I told you to trust. That's my fault, not yours. But I'm not helpless. I could have. You're blind in a house controlled by people who decided to hurt you. Randy's voice was gentle, but his eyes held something cold and calculating. That's not weakness. That's victimization. And it ends now. After she'd eaten what her stomach could handle, after he'd helped her to the bathroom and back to bed, after she'd finally fallen asleep again with her hand curled around his, Randy sat in the chair beside her bed and watched her breathe. The guilt was physical, a weight pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He'd promised her when she lost her sight that he'd protect her, that she'd never be vulnerable again, that he'd left his old life behind and become someone worthy of her trust. And he'd failed completely, because he'd trusted the wrong people now. Because he'd believed that legitimate business meant legitimate friends, because he'd forgotten that betrayal didn't care whether you laundered your money. It found you anyway. I left the streets for you, Debbie, Randy whispered to the sleeping woman who couldn't hear him. Buried the ghost of Harlem because you asked me to. Promised I'd never be that man again. His hand tightened around hers. But the streets followed us home. And the ghost. He paused, feeling something cold and familiar settling over him like an old coat. The ghost never really left. He was just sleeping. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Randy pulled it out, expecting Frankie Vance or one of his actual loyal associates. Instead, the screen showed, unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Then something, instinct, paranoia, the same sense that had kept him alive through 2 decades in the underworld, made him accept the call. Silence on the line. Then a voice, distorted, mechanical. Stop asking questions about her medicine. Randy's blood went cold. Who is this? Someone giving you good advice. Let it go. Accept the diagnosis. Stop digging. The distorted voice paused. Or things will get much worse for Mrs. Sawyer. If you touch her. We already did, and she never saw us coming. A sound like laughter filtered through static. That's the beauty of blindness, Mr. Sawyer. It's so easy to control what someone can't see. The line went dead. Randy stared at his phone for a long moment. Then very carefully, he set it on the nightstand and stood. He walked to the window, looking out at the sound, at the sunrise painting water gold and red. His reflection stared back at him, older, softer, the face of a man who'd tried to retire from violence. But behind that reflection, Randy could see someone else, something else. The ghost of Harlem, fully awake now. And Randy realized with perfect, terrible clarity they'd made a mistake. Whoever they were, Tony or someone above Tony, or some conspiracy that stretched deeper than he'd imagined, they'd made the fatal error of threatening the one person in the world Randy Sawyer had ever truly loved. You could betray him, steal from him, even try to kill him. But you didn't hurt Debbie. Not without consequences that would make men remember why some ghosts were better left buried. Randy touched the window glass, his reflection's eyes cold and certain. "I'm sorry, Debbie," he whispered. "But the promise I made you? I'm going to have to break it. Just this once. Just long enough to bury everyone who hurt you." His phone vibrated again. This time, it was Frankie Vance. Randy answered. "Frankie, I need you to find someone for me. Someone who doesn't exist. Goes by Dr. Chen." "What's this about, boss?" Randy's reflection smiled. Sharp, predatory. Nothing like the man Debbie had fallen in love with. "It's about reminding people why they used to fear the ghost of Harlem." He hung up and stood watching the water turn from gold to blood red in the dying light. The war had begun, and Randy Sawyer intended to win it the only way he knew how, completely, methodically, without mercy, one ghost at a time. Randy waited until Debbie was sleeping soundly before he began his search. Her medicine cabinet was organized with the obsessive precision of someone who couldn't see, each bottle positioned exactly where muscle memory could find it. Randy photographed everything before disturbing the arrangement, then pulled out each prescription one by one. Latanoprost, for managing eye pressure. Gabapentin, for nerve pain. Prednisone, anti-inflammatory. Vitamin B12, standard supplement. He laid them on the bathroom counter like evidence at a crime scene and began cross-referencing dates. The latanoprost bottle was dated 8 months ago. Prescribed by Dr. Morrison, filled at the pharmacy they'd used for years. Normal. Expected. But the refill from 6 months ago, same bottle, same pharmacy label, had a different lot number. Randy pulled up his phone, accessing the pharmacy database through connections that still existed from his old life. The lot number didn't match any records from that pharmacy. His hands stilled on the bottle. Someone had replaced the contents. He checked the gabapentin. Same issue. Original prescription from Morrison, dated 10 months ago, but a refill from 7 months ago showed a lot number that didn't exist in any legitimate pharmaceutical database. Randy's chest tightened. He checked the prednisone. The B12. Every single bottle showed the same pattern. Legitimate prescriptions initially, then suspicious refills that appeared around the time Debbie's vision had started deteriorating. He opened the latanoprost bottle, tipped a pill onto his palm. It looked right, small, round, white. But Randy had spent enough time around pharmaceutical counterfeiting operations to know that appearance meant nothing. You could press anything into a pill shape if you had the right equipment. His phone was in his hand before he consciously decided to make the call. Morrison. The doctor's voice was groggy, annoyed. It was past midnight. "This better be important." "It's Randy Sawyer. I need you to tell me exactly what medications you prescribed for Debbie. Every single one. Dosages, refill schedules, everything." "Randy, Jesus, it's 1 a.m. Can this wait until—" "No." Randy's voice cut through the doctor's protest like a blade. "It can't. My wife was starved for 3 days while I was gone. Someone's been tampering with her medications. And I need to know what she was supposed to be taking versus what she was actually given." Silence on the line. Then Morrison's voice, suddenly alert. "Tampering? Randy, that's a serious accusation. Who would— I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. Now tell me about the prescriptions." For the next 10 minutes, Morrison walked Randy through every medication he'd prescribed over the past year. Randy compared them against the bottles in front of him, and with each discrepancy, the cold fury in his chest grew colder. The latanoprost dosage had been doubled in the suspicious refill, enough to potentially damage the optic nerve instead of protecting it. The gabapentin, which Morrison had prescribed at 300 milliliters, showed pills marked 900 milliliters in the counterfeit bottle, triple the intended dose, enough to cause neurological damage. And the prednisone, which Morrison had explicitly taken her off 6 months ago, somehow had a fresh refill dated from that same period. "Someone's been poisoning her," Randy said quietly. "Systematically. For at least 6 months." That's... Morrison's breath caught. "Randy, that would explain the rapid deterioration. We thought it was aggressive progression, but if someone was actively damaging her optic nerve through medication..." He paused. "Jesus Christ. Her blindness might not be permanent. If we can identify what she was given, if we can stop the exposure..." "How long?" Randy's voice was tight. "How long before we know if the damage is reversible?" "I'd need to see her immediately, run comprehensive tests, but Randy..." Morrison's voice hardened. "Whoever did this didn't just commit assault. This is attempted murder. Slow, calculated, virtually undetectable. We need to call the police." "No police, not yet." Randy was already moving, gathering the pill bottles into an evidence bag. "First, I need to know who, then I need to know why. Then I decide what happens to them." He hung up before Morrison could argue. Randy's home office was on the ground floor, behind a door that looked like a closet, but opened into a soundproofed room where he'd conducted business he preferred Debbie not to hear. The filing cabinets held years of financial records, legitimate businesses layered over carefully laundered money, tax returns that would survive any audit, investment portfolios that looked clean because they were. On paper, Randy Sawyer was a model citizen. But in the locked drawer at the bottom of his desk, Randy kept the other records. The ones that documented where the money really came from, who really controlled what. The map of his old empire, preserved in case he ever needed to remember who owed him favors, or who owed him blood. He found Debbie's medical records in a separate folder, organized chronologically. Every doctor's visit, every prescription, every bill. He'd kept meticulous records because her health mattered more than anything in his carefully constructed new life. And there, handling almost every transaction, coordinating every payment, was Tony DeLuca's signature. Randy spread the bills across his desk, seeing the pattern he'd been too trusting to notice before. 7 months ago, a bill from Dr. Morrison's office for Debbie's regular checkup. Paid by Tony, as usual, nothing suspicious. But 2 weeks later, another bill from a medical office Randy didn't recognize. Ashford Neurological Consultants. The charge was listed as a follow-up examination, also paid by Tony, without mentioning it to Randy. Randy searched the name. No practice called Ashford Neurological existed in New York. The address on the bill traced to a UPS store in Queens. A shell company. 6 months ago, another bill. This one from Chen Medical Associates. Again, an address that led nowhere real. Again, paid promptly by Tony. Randy's hands clenched on the papers. Tony hadn't just been stealing money under Debbie's medical fund. He'd been creating fake medical visits, fake doctors, fake paper trails to cover whatever they were doing to her. But why? Why poison her? Why destroy her sight? What did Tony gain from... Randy froze, a memory surfacing. 8 months ago, he'd updated his will, a routine revision with his estate lawyer, making sure Debbie would be protected if anything happened to him. The estate was structured carefully, most assets in trust, managed by a board of advisors Randy had personally selected. And on that board, with significant control over investment decisions, Tony DeLuca. But there was a clause, a specific provision Randy had insisted on. If Debbie became incapacitated, legally declared unable to manage her own affairs, control of her inheritance would pass to the trustee board for management purposes, and the board chairman, with final authority over all financial decisions, was Tony. Randy's blood turned to ice. It wasn't about hurting Debbie. It was never about her at all. It was about control, about positioning, about making Debbie helpless enough that she could be legally declared incompetent, transferring millions in assets to Tony's management. Blind was bad enough. But blind and mentally compromised, if the medications they were giving her caused cognitive damage on top of the vision loss, would be enough for any court to grant conservatorship. And once Tony controlled her finances, he'd control Randy's estate, the legitimate businesses, the real estate holdings, everything Randy had spent 2 decades building. "You didn't just want my money," Randy whispered to the empty office. "You wanted my wife's mind too." His phone buzzed. Text message from Frankie Vance. "Found your Dr. Chen, real name Chen Wei Lin, unlicensed practitioner, history of medical fraud in California. Went underground 3 years ago. Last known associate, pharmaceutical counterfeiting ring. Want me to pick him up?" Randy's fingers moved across the keyboard. "Not yet. Find out who hired him, who's paying him. I want the whole chain, not just the bottom link." Another text arrived before he could set the phone down. This one from an unknown number. "You're still asking questions. That's disappointing. Check your wife's old caretaker's apartment. Building 7, Unit 23. What you find there should convince you to stop digging. Or keep digging, and find out what happens to blind women who can't see threats coming." Randy stared at the message. It was a threat, obviously, but it was also information. The old caretaker, Rebecca Martinez, who'd worked for them before Luca, had quit suddenly 6 months ago. Claimed a family emergency in Arizona, left without notice, never answered follow-up calls. Randy had thought it was odd but hadn't pressed. There were always more caretakers, and Debbie's care was what mattered. Now he wondered if Rebecca had seen something, known something, been paid off or scared off or... Randy grabbed his jacket and the pills from the bathroom. He needed answers, and if someone was stupid enough to direct him toward evidence, he'd take it and use it to bury them. The apartment building was in Queens, a pre-war walk-up that had seen better decades. Randy found Unit 23 on the 3rd floor, the door locked with a cheap deadbolt he opened in 15 seconds with tools he'd promised Debbie he'd thrown away. The apartment was empty, furniture gone, walls bare, carpets showing the ghost marks where heavy items had sat for years. But in the kitchen, tucked behind the ancient refrigerator, Randy found what he was looking for. A folder, half-burned, edges blackened like someone had tried to destroy it in the sink and given up halfway through. Randy pulled it out carefully, his hands surprisingly steady despite the rage building in his chest. Inside, medical lab results, dated 7 months ago. Patient name, Deborah Sawyer. Blood work showing elevated levels of methanol. Urine analysis showing traces of organophosphates. Tissue samples indicating systematic poisoning over an extended period. And at the bottom, a handwritten note in Rebecca's familiar script. "They're killing her slowly. I tried to tell someone. No one believes the help. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sawyer. I'm so sorry." Randy's vision blurred. He braced himself against the counter, the folder trembling in his hands. Rebecca had known, had documented it, had probably tried to warn someone, Randy maybe, or the police or a doctor, and been shut down, paid off or threatened off, made to disappear before she could expose what was happening. And Debbie had kept getting sicker, kept taking her medicine, kept losing her sight piece by piece while Randy trusted the wrong people to care for her. The poisoning had started at least 7 months ago, maybe longer. Slow, careful, calculated to look like natural disease progression. Randy had been so focused on legitimate doctors, on expensive treatments, on doing everything right, He'd never considered that the threat was inside his own house. Tony had handled all of it. The bills, the medications, the caretaker changes. Tony had positioned himself as Randy's most trusted advisor, the man who managed details so Randy could focus on business. And Randy had been grateful, had trusted completely, had been an absolute fool. Randy carefully folded the lab results into his jacket pocket and left the apartment. His hands didn't shake anymore. The trembling rage had crystallized into something colder, more focused, purposeful. Back home, Randy poured himself a whiskey in his dark office. The lab results sat on his desk beside the counterfeit medication bottles. Evidence of systematic, calculated poisoning. Evidence of conspiracy. Evidence that Debbie's blindness, the thing that had broken both their hearts, that had changed their entire lives, was manufactured, engineered, preventable. Randy raised the glass to his lips but didn't drink, just stared at his reflection in the dark window. Seeing the ghost of Harlem staring back. They didn't just starve her, he whispered to his reflection. To the ghost, to whatever he was becoming as the last fragments of the legitimate businessman fell away. They took her sight. His phone buzzed. Frankie again. Chen Wei-lin was hired through an intermediary. Payments traced back to an offshore account registered to TLD Holdings. That's one of Tony's shell companies. You want me to… Randy didn't read the rest. Didn't need to. He set down the whiskey untouched and stood. Walked upstairs to where Debbie was sleeping, her sightless eyes moving beneath closed lids, dreaming dreams she could no longer see. Randy sat beside her bed in the darkness, watching her breathe, and made a decision. Tony DeLuca had poisoned his wife, had stolen from him, had systematically destroyed the woman Randy loved more than his own life. And for that, Tony was going to learn exactly what the ghost of Harlem did to people who hurt what belonged to him. Not quickly, not mercifully, but absolutely, completely. Until nothing remained but ashes and the memory of why you don't betray a man who built an empire on fear. Randy took Debbie's hand gently, careful not to wake her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I promised I'd left that life behind. But they brought it to our door. They hurt you. And now…" His voice hardened. "Now they're going to learn why some promises are worth breaking." Outside, dawn was breaking over the sound. Inside, the ghost of Harlem was preparing for war. The Debbie Sawyer Medical Trust had been Randy's first legitimate act of love. He'd established it 10 years ago, right after they'd gotten married, back when he was still knee-deep in the streets but trying to build something clean for her. $20 million, carefully laundered through real estate investments and consulting fees, placed in an irrevocable trust with one purpose: ensure Debbie would always have access to the best medical care, no matter what happened to him. It was insurance against his old life catching up, against enemies putting her in crosshairs, against the day when Randy's past might get him killed and leave her alone. He'd never imagined the threat would come from inside his own circle. Randy sat in his office at 3 a.m, scrolling through bank records he'd pulled using access codes only 3 people should have known: himself, his estate lawyer, and the trust administrator, Tony DeLuca. The trust balance should have been sitting at $23.4 million after a decade of conservative growth. Instead, it showed $8.7 million. $14 million. Gone. Randy clicked through transaction histories, his jaw tightening with each entry. The money had been moved systematically over 18 months, never large enough to trigger automatic alerts, always categorized under legitimate-sounding medical expenses. Advanced treatment protocols, $250,000. Specialized equipment acquisition, $400,000. International consultation fees, $175,000. Line after line of fabricated charges, each one approved with Debbie's electronic signature. Randy pulled up the authorization forms and felt his blood turn to ice. The signatures were perfect. Too perfect. Debbie's handwriting had changed after she lost her sight, became shakier, less controlled as she learned to sign documents by touch and muscle memory. But these signatures were steady, confident, identical to how she'd signed before the blindness. They'd been forged, probably scanned from old documents and digitally inserted. Randy traced the money's path through shell corporations and offshore accounts, the same laundering techniques he'd used himself for years. Eventually, every dollar led to accounts registered under TLD Holdings, Bayside Consulting Group, and Harlem Strategic Partners. All companies Tony controlled. All companies Randy had helped Tony establish as part of their legitimate business expansion. His oldest friend had been robbing him blind, literally, using the very infrastructure Randy had built to protect Debbie. Randy's hands clenched on the desk hard enough to make the wood creak. Tony's brownstone in Brooklyn Heights was lit up like a celebration when Randy arrived at 8 a.m. Through the front window, Randy could see Tony at the breakfast table, reading the newspaper with coffee and croissants like a man without a care in the world. Angela moved in the background, dressed for her gallery opening. Normal. Peaceful. The picture of successful, legitimate life. Randy knocked. Tony answered the door himself, surprise flickering across his face before the smooth smile settled into place. "Randy, this is unexpected." Tony stepped aside, gesturing him in. "Everything okay? Debbie's not—" "Debbie's fine." Randy walked past him into the foyer, taking in the renovations since he'd last visited. New hardwood floors, fresh paint, expensive art on the walls, originals, not prints. "Place looks good. Business must be treating you well." "Can't complain." Tony led him to the study, closing the door behind them. "Coffee? You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." Randy remained standing, hands in his pockets, posture casual. "Been going through some financial records. Debbie's medical trust specifically." He watched Tony's face carefully, saw the microsecond of tension before the concern mask slid into place. "The trust? Is there a problem? I can pull the latest statements if you need." "Already have them." Randy pulled out his phone, scrolled to a screenshot of the balance. Interesting how $14 million can just disappear over 18 months. Medical expenses, apparently. Medical expenses for Debbie's treatments, yes. Tony moved behind his desk, pulling up files on his computer with practiced ease. "I have detailed records of every expenditure. You authorized me to handle her care while you were traveling. I authorized you to coordinate with Dr. Morrison, not to drain her trust fund." "Randy, I understand you're upset about finding Debbie in distress the other night. I take full responsibility for the communication breakdown with Luca. But these accusations about the trust—" Tony turned his monitor toward Randy, showing spreadsheets and invoices. "Every dollar is accounted for. Experimental treatments, specialist consultations, equipment purchases. I have Debbie's signed authorizations for everything." "Those signatures are forged." Tony's expression flickered, just for a second, before the concerned friend mask returned. "That's a serious allegation. Randy, I think you're exhausted and emotional. Finding Debbie like that was traumatic. I understand, but—" "Show me the invoices." Randy moved closer to the desk. "The actual invoices from the providers, not your spreadsheets. Original documents." "Of course." Tony clicked through folders with the confidence of a man who'd prepared for this conversation. He pulled up scanned invoices, professional letterhead, detailed line items, payment confirmations. Ashford Neurological, Chen Medical Associates, Pacific Treatment Center. All legitimate providers handling Debbie's complex case. Randy studied the documents. They looked real, felt real, would probably fool an auditor. But Randy had spent 20 years building an empire on forged documents. He knew what to look for. "The Ashford Neurological address," Randy said quietly. "That's a UPS store in Queens." "A billing address. Many medical practices use—" "Chen Medical Associates doesn't exist. I had it checked." Randy's voice stayed level. "And Pacific Treatment Center? That's a shell corporation registered in the Caymans." He looked up from the screen, meeting Tony's eyes. "Want to guess who owns it?" Silence stretched between them like wire pulled taut. TLD Holdings, Randy continued. Your company, Tony. You've been paying yourself with Debbie's money, creating fake medical providers to justify the transfers. He tilted his head. What I can't figure out is why. You're my consigliere. You make 7 figures a year. You have equity in half our legitimate ventures. Why steal from my wife's medical fund? Tony's mask finally cracked. Not into guilt or shame, but into something colder, more calculating. Because it's not stealing, Tony said quietly. It's reallocation, strategic repositioning of assets during your transition period. My transition period? To retirement. Tony leaned back in his chair, his whole demeanor shifting. The concerned friend disappeared, replaced by something sharper, more honest. Randy, you've been out of the game for years, playing businessman, playing husband, pretending the streets don't exist anymore. But the empire we built? It still needs management, real management. I gave you management authority. You gave me a leash. Tony's voice hardened. Everything runs through you. Every major decision needs your approval. I'm your consigliere, but I'm treated like a fucking secretary. He gestured at the invoices on screen. This money, I earned it. Running operations while you played house with your blind wife. Keeping your legitimate businesses profitable while you focused on medical appointments and wheelchair accessibility. Randy's hands clenched in his pockets, but his face stayed perfectly calm. So you poisoned her. I didn't poison anyone. The counterfeit medications, the neurotoxins in her blood work, the fake doctors feeding her chemicals that destroyed her optic nerve. Randy took a step closer. That was you, Tony. Don't insult me by denying it. Tony stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, not the friendly smile, but something colder, more honest. You're guessing, Tony said. You have suspicions but no proof, no chain of custody, no witnesses who'll testify, just paranoia and grief talking. I have Rebecca Martinez's lab results. The ones she hid before you made her disappear. Tony's smile faltered, just slightly. Rebecca quit. Family emergency. Rebecca documented Debbie's poisoning, blood work showing methanol exposure, tissue samples showing systematic contamination. Randy pulled the half-burned folder from his jacket, dropped it on Tony's desk. She tried to warn someone. You shut her up, paid her off or scared her off. But she left evidence. Tony looked at the folder but didn't touch it. Even if that's real, even if Rebecca thought she saw something, it doesn't prove anything. Debbie was sick. She was taking medications. Sometimes medications have side effects. Sometimes diseases progress unpredictably. Her signatures were forged. Computer error. Administrative mistake. $14 million disappeared. Into legitimate medical treatments. Tony spread his hands. Randy, you're building a conspiracy theory out of coincidence and exhaustion. Yes, Debbie got worse under my care. Yes, I made administrative decisions you weren't fully briefed on. But that's not criminal. That's me doing my job while you were unavailable. Randy studied his oldest friend. This man he'd trusted with everything, who'd stood beside him through gang wars and federal investigations, who'd helped him build a legitimate empire from street-level violence, and saw a stranger wearing Tony's face. Debbie told me something this morning, Randy said quietly. Said you visited her often while I was traveling. Spoke softly. Offered help. I was checking on her. That's what friends do. She said you'd stand close, touch her hand, tell her she was alone. Randy's voice stayed level, but something in his eyes went cold. Tell her that I'd abandoned her for business, that she was a burden I'd eventually leave behind. Tony's expression didn't change, but Randy saw the truth in his silence. You weren't just stealing money, Randy continued. You were breaking her. Psychologically, making her feel helpless, isolated, dependent. Setting up a conservatorship claim, probably. Get her declared incompetent, take control of her finances, and by extension, he paused. By extension, take control of my estate through the trust structure. That's insane. That's smart. Randy's tone carried something like respect, almost admiration. It's exactly what I would have done if I wanted to take over someone's empire without getting blood on my hands. Poison the wife slowly, make it look like disease, isolate her, break her mentally. Then step in as the caring administrator when she can't manage her own affairs anymore. He tilted his head. How long before you'd have had me declared unfit, too? Grief-stricken over Debbie's decline, making irrational decisions, requiring professional management? Tony said nothing, but the silence was answer enough. Randy nodded slowly. I'm going to leave now, and you're going to think you got away with this, that I don't have enough proof, that you can smooth talk your way through an audit or destroy whatever evidence remains. Randy, but here's what you don't understand, Tony. Randy moved to the door, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I don't need proof for what I'm going to do to you. I don't need courts or lawyers or evidence chains, because the man who's coming for you? He looked back over his shoulder. That's not Randy Sawyer, legitimate businessman. That's the ghost of Harlem. And ghosts don't follow legal procedures. He left before Tony could respond. Debbie was awake when Randy returned home, sitting in her reading chair with a braille book she wasn't reading. Randy? Her head turned toward his footsteps, always knowing his weight on the floorboards. Where were you? Visiting Tony. Randy sat across from her, studying her face in the morning light. Debbie, I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be completely honest. Okay. Her hands stilled on the book. When Tony visited while I was traveling, what did he say to you? Exactly. Debbie's face tightened. I told you this morning. He offered help, asked if I needed anything. What else? Randy. What else, Debbie? She was quiet for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said you were pulling away, that the business was consuming you again, that I was becoming a burden you resented caring for. Her voice broke slightly. He said you'd mentioned feeling trapped, that you missed your old life, your freedom. Randy's jaw clenched. I never said that. I know. I knew then too. But when you're blind and alone and people stop feeding you... She wiped her eyes. It's easy to believe the worst. Easy to think maybe they're right. Maybe you do resent me. I could never... He'd stand close, Debbie continued, her voice stronger now, angry. Too close. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. Smell his cologne. He'd touch my hand, my shoulder, my face. Tell me he'd take care of me if you left, that he'd always valued me more than you did. Randy's hands clenched on the chair arms. I didn't tell you because... Debbie's voice cracked. Because I didn't want to bring your old life home. Didn't want to create conflict in your circle. I thought if I just endured it, if I just stayed quiet, you could keep building your legitimate business without complications from... She gestured at herself. From the blind wife who causes problems. Randy crossed to her, knelt beside her chair, took her hands in his. You didn't cause problems, he said quietly. Tony did, and I'm going to fix it. How? Randy didn't answer. Just held her hands and thought about security footage he'd reviewed after leaving Tony's brownstone. The cameras outside Debbie's bedroom had been wiped clean for the past 6 months. Professional deletion, no recovery possible. But Randy's security system had redundancies, backup drives in a safe location that even Tony didn't know about. He'd found one clip, just one, from 7 months ago, right when Debbie's vision had started failing catastrophically. Tony, standing over Debbie's sleeping form, whispering something too quiet for the audio to capture. Then reaching out, Randy had watched this part 3 times and switching her medication bottles, replacing the legitimate prescriptions with counterfeits. And before leaving, Tony had looked directly at the camera, smiled, and shut off the feed. He'd known about the cameras, had probably known about the backups too, but missed one. A single piece of evidence showing deliberate, calculated poisoning. It wouldn't hold up in court. Any lawyer could argue tampering, manipulation, reasonable doubt. But Randy didn't need court. He needed certainty. And now he had it. Randy? Debbie's voice pulled him back. What are you going to do? Randy looked at his wife, blind because of Tony's greed, broken because of Tony's cruelty, humiliated because of Tony's calculated campaign to destroy her. I'm going to keep my promise, Randy said quietly. The one I made when you lost your sight. That you'd always be safe, always be protected. That no one would ever hurt you again. But you promised to leave your old life behind. I did. Randy stood, kissed her forehead gently. But Tony brought it back. So now I'm going to remind him, and everyone else, why they used to fear the ghost of Harlem. Debbie grabbed his hand. Randy, please, don't do something you can't come back from. Randy squeezed her hand once, then let go. I'm already there, Debbie. I was there the moment I found you crawling for water while he laughed in our house. He walked to his office, closed the door, and made a call. Frankie, Randy said when his most loyal associate answered. Round up the old crew, not the business associates, the real ones, the ones who remember Harlem. Boss, what are we doing? Randy looked at his reflection in the dark window, saw the ghost staring back, fully awake, fully present, fully ready. We're going to war. If you're still hooked and ready to continue with the story, remember to subscribe and give this video a like, because your support helps a lot. Let's continue. Randy found the device by accident. He was changing Debbie's bedsheets, something he'd been doing himself since firing the entire household staff except Maria, who'd at least tried to help, when his hand brushed against something hard tucked under her pillow. A small digital voice recorder, the kind journalists used, the kind someone who couldn't see might use to document a world they could only hear. Randy held it in his palm, staring at the small screen showing 47 recorded files. The date stretched back 8 months, starting right around when Debbie's vision had begun its catastrophic decline. His thumb hovered over the play button. Debbie was downstairs with Dr. Morrison, undergoing tests to determine if the poisoning damage could be reversed. She'd be occupied for hours. Randy had time. He pressed play on the first file. Static. Then Debbie's voice, uncertain and quiet. I don't know if I'm being paranoid. Randy says I'm safe, but something feels wrong. Tony was here again today. He stood too close, said things that... A pause. I'm going to start recording, just in case, just so someone knows if something happens. Randy's chest tightened. He sat on the edge of the bed and scrolled to the next file. More static. Then Debbie again. Tony brought my medication today. New bottles. He said Dr. Morrison changed the prescription. But when I asked Dr. Morrison about it during my last appointment, he seemed confused, said nothing had changed. The sound of pills rattling. I don't know what to do. If I tell Randy, he'll go back to being who he was. And I can't do that to him. Can't pull him back into violence because I'm paranoid about medication. Randy's hands clenched around the device. He scrolled faster, sampling files at random. Most were Debbie's observations, Tony's visits, strange conversations with Luca, medications that made her feel worse instead of better. Her voice grew weaker in each recording, more confused, more frightened. But it was file 31 that made Randy's blood turn to ice. He pressed play, and Tony DeLuca's voice filled the quiet bedroom, not speaking to Debbie, speaking to someone else. Luca, Randy realized, recognizing the nurse's stammering responses. Don't understand why we have to... Luca's voice, nervous. Because I said so. Tony's voice, sharp with authority. The medication schedule changes tonight. Double the dosage on the gabapentin, and stop bringing her solid food after tomorrow. But Mr. DeLuca, she's already weak. If we don't feed her, she'll learn her place. Tony's laugh, cruel, satisfied. The queen's blind and the king's gone. Guess who runs the palace now? Randy's vision tunneled. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the recorder. He forced himself to breathe, to stay still, to listen. "What if Mr. Sawyer finds out?" Luca asked. "Randy's in Milan chasing legitimate business deals like a reformed choir boy." Tony's voice dripped with contempt. "He's so busy pretending to be clean, he can't see what's happening in his own house. By the time he notices, Debbie will be too far gone to matter, legally incompetent. And guess who gets to manage her affairs? This feels wrong. What feels wrong is me doing all the work while Randy plays retirement. This is compensation, long overdue." A pause. "Now, about the feeding schedule. I want her weak enough to need constant care by the time Randy gets back. Make her beg, Luca. It'll be fun to watch." The recording ended. Randy sat in absolute silence, the device trembling in his hands. "Make her beg. It'll be fun to watch." The words echoed in his head like gunshots. Tony, his oldest friend, his most trusted advisor, the man Randy had elevated from street-level enforcer to legitimate businessman, had tortured Debbie for entertainment. Not just for money, not just for power, for fun. Randy's finger moved to the next file. His hands had stopped shaking. Something colder had settled over him, something that didn't shake or hesitate or feel anything but absolute crystalline certainty. File 32, dated 3 days ago, the day before Randy had found Debbie crawling across the patio. Tony's voice again, but different, softer, more intimate, speaking directly to Debbie. "Randy's not coming back, you know." Tony's voice was gentle, almost kind. The cruelty made it worse. "Oh, he'll come home eventually, but the man you married, the one who promised to protect you? He's gone, replaced by a businessman who's embarrassed by his blind wife, who resents being tied down to a woman who can't even see him anymore." "That's not true." Debbie's voice, weak but defiant. "Randy loves me. Randy loves his empire, his money, his legitimate respectability." Footsteps. Tony walking closer. "You're just a reminder of what he used to be, a liability he's too sentimental to dispose of properly. But me? A sound like a hand touching fabric. I see your value. Always have. When Randy finally abandons you, and he will, I'll be here. To take care of you. To give you the attention you deserve. Don't touch me. You can't even see me touching you." Tony's laugh, soft and cruel. "That's the beauty of blindness, Debbie. You never know who's really there, who's really in control. You just have to trust. And right now, the only person you can trust is me." Randy will. "Randy will what? Come home and save you?" More laughter. "Randy's in Milan drinking wine and signing contracts. He has no idea you're suffering. And by the time he figures it out, you'll be too broken to save." Silence. Then Debbie's voice, barely a whisper. "I hate you." "Good. Hate keeps you alive. And I need you alive. At least until the conservatorship goes through." Footsteps retreating. "Sweet dreams, Debbie. I'll see you tomorrow. Though I suppose see is relative in your case." A door closing. Then silence, broken only by Debbie's quiet crying. Randy's chest felt like it was collapsing. He'd heard men beg for their lives, heard bones break, heard the last breath leave bodies he'd put in the ground. But nothing had ever gutted him like hearing his wife cry alone in the dark while his oldest friend mocked her helplessness. There was one more recording. File 47, dated 2 nights ago. Randy's finger hovered over the play button. Part of him didn't want to hear it. Didn't want to know what else Tony had done. What other cruelties had been inflicted while Randy was thousands of miles away trusting the wrong people. But he had to know, had to hear all of it. Had to let the rage build until it became something pure and focused and absolutely unstoppable. He pressed play. No voices this time. Just breathing. Debbie's breathing, quiet and controlled. Then, barely above a whisper, her voice. God, I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if you care about the prayers of a blind woman who married a killer and thought love could save him. But if you're there, if you're real, please bring Randy home. A sob, quickly stifled. I'm so tired, so hungry. I can't, I can't keep fighting. Can't keep pretending I'm strong when I can't even find the bathroom without help. Tony says Randy's forgotten me, that I'm just a burden now. And maybe, her voice broke, maybe he's right. Maybe I am just something Randy's too kind to leave behind. But I need him. I need him to come home and... Silence. Then so quietly Randy almost missed it. I need him to be the ghost again, just this once, just long enough to make them stop. The recording ended. Randy sat in the darkness of their bedroom, the device in his hands, and felt something inside him break clean in half. Debbie, his brilliant, kind, fiercely independent wife who'd convinced him to leave the streets, who'd believed he could be more than violence and fear, had prayed for the ghost of Harlem to come back, had needed the monster he'd buried, had suffered alone in the dark, being tortured by Randy's oldest friend, and had asked God to send the killer Randy used to be. Randy stood slowly, walked to the window, looked out at the sound painted gold by the setting sun. He rewound file 32, listened to Tony mock Debbie again. Make her beg, it'll be fun to watch. Rewound file 47, heard his wife pray. I need him to be the ghost again. Randy played the recordings on loop, one after the other. Tony's cruelty, Debbie's prayer, Tony's laughter, Debbie's tears. Over and over until the sun set completely, and the room filled with darkness, and the recordings became the only sound in a world that had narrowed to a single purpose. Dawn broke over the sound, while Randy stood at the window, still listening. The recordings had played 47 times. Once for each file. Once for each piece of evidence that Tony DeLuca had tortured the only person Randy Sawyer had ever truly loved. When the first light touched the water, Randy finally stopped the playback. He looked at his reflection in the window and saw the ghost of Harlem staring back, not the retired criminal trying to go legitimate, but the thing he'd been before Debbie had saved him. Cold, patient, absolutely certain. The man who'd built an empire on fear and blood, and the absolute certainty that you don't cross the ghost of Harlem without paying a price that makes other men remember why. Randy pulled out his phone, called Frankie Vance. Boss? Frankie's voice was alert despite the early hour. Everything okay? No. Randy's voice was perfectly level, empty of everything except purpose. Everything's not okay, but it's going to be. What do you need? The old crew, the ones who remember Harlem, the ones who know what I really am under the suits and the real estate deals. Randy paused. We're not businessmen anymore, Frankie. We're back in the business of justice. What kind of justice? Randy looked at the voice recorder in his hand, thought about Debbie crawling for water, thought about Tony standing over her sleeping form, mocking her, poisoning her, breaking her piece by piece. The Old Testament kind, Randy said quietly. Eye for an eye, blood for blood. The kind where everyone remembers why you don't hurt what belongs to the ghost of Harlem. Silence on the line. Then Frankie's voice, hard with understanding. When do we start? Today. Right now. I want Tony DeLuca under surveillance 24 hours a day. I want to know everywhere he goes, everyone he talks to, every breath he takes. Randy's reflection smiled, sharp, predatory, nothing human about it. And Frankie? Start reaching out to the old network. The legitimate businesses close their doors. We're going back to basics, one last time. You sure about this, boss? You spent 20 years going legitimate, building something clean for Debbie. If you go back now... Debbie prayed for the ghost to come back, Randy interrupted. Prayed for me to be the monster I used to be. Because that monster would have protected her, would have seen Tony's betrayal coming, would have burned down anyone who hurt her. His voice hardened. I tried to be better, tried to be worthy of her love, and all it did was leave her vulnerable to people who mistook mercy for weakness. So what's the play? Randy thought about the recordings, about Tony's laugh, about Debbie's tears. The play is simple, Randy said. Tony wanted to run the palace while the king was gone? Fine. Let him. Let him think he won. Let him celebrate his victory. Randy's smile widened. And then the king comes home, and everyone remembers what happens to people who touch what belongs to him. How long do we give him? 1 week. Let him feel safe. Let him think I don't know, don't suspect, can't prove anything. Randy turned from the window. And then we take everything. His money, his freedom, his allies, his dignity, everything he stole from Debbie, we take from him, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but ashes and the memory of why you don't betray the ghost of Harlem. What about the law? If we do this, there's no going back. No more legitimate business. No more clean money. Randy looked at the voice recorder one more time. Make her beg. It'll be fun to watch. I don't care about going back, Randy said quietly. I care about Debbie, about making sure every man who hurt her understands they made a fatal mistake. The law can have what's left when I'm done. Understood. I'll make the calls. Randy hung up and stood in his bedroom, surrounded by evidence of Tony's betrayal, and felt the last pieces of Randy Sawyer, legitimate businessman, reformed criminal, man trying to deserve his wife's love, fall away like a shed skin. What remained was the ghost of Harlem, pure, focused, absolutely certain, and Tony DeLuca, along with everyone who'd helped him torture a blind woman for profit and entertainment, was about to learn why some ghosts should never be awakened. Because once they wake up, they don't stop haunting until every debt is paid. In blood, in screams, in absolute, irreversible destruction. Randy pocketed the voice recorder and went downstairs to check on Debbie. The war had begun, and this time, the ghost wasn't building an empire. He was burning one down. The invitation went out 3 days after Randy found the recordings. Elegant cardstock, hand-delivered by men in dark suits. A dinner at the Sawyer estate. Friday evening, 8 o'clock, business attire, RSVP required. The message was simple. Time to move forward. Let's discuss the future. Tony received his at the brownstone, hand-delivered by Frankie Vance himself. He'd stared at it for a long moment, then smiled and confirmed his attendance. Marco and Vincent received theirs at their respective offices. The accountant and the investment advisor who'd eaten prime rib while Debbie crawled for water. Luca received his at the apartment where he'd been hiding since Randy fired him. The nurse had tried to refuse, but the man delivering the invitation had made it clear this wasn't optional. By Wednesday, all 4 had confirmed. By Thursday, Randy's estate had been transformed. The dining room looked like something from another era. Long mahogany tables set with crystal and china Randy hadn't used in years. Candelabras casting soft light that made the room feel intimate despite its size. Wine breathing in decanters. Bottles that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The kind of spread that spoke of wealth, power, and the careful attention to detail that separated legitimate businessmen from street thugs. Randy stood at the head of the table in a tailored charcoal suit, surveying his work with the critical eye of a man staging a performance. Everything had to be perfect. Every detail had to serve the narrative he was building. This was reconciliation. This was moving forward. This was Randy Sawyer, the legitimate businessman, extending an olive branch to men who'd misunderstood his intentions. That's what they needed to believe when they walked through his door. Maria had been dismissed for the evening, sent home with a generous bonus and instructions not to return until Monday. The only staff remaining were Randy's men. Frankie Vance stationed near the entrance, Marcus Stone by the kitchen, Jimmy Woo watching the security monitors. Men who'd stood beside Randy in Harlem, who remembered what the ghost did to people who crossed him, who'd followed him into legitimate business, but never forgotten how to handle the illegitimate kind. At 7:45, Randy's phone buzzed. A text from the secure line he'd set up that morning. "I'm ready. Can hear everything. Randy, please be careful. Debbie. Safe in a private medical facility 2 hours north, receiving treatment for the poisoning under Dr. Morrison's direct supervision. Recovering. Getting stronger. But still connected to this house through the encrypted audio feed Randy had installed. She'd wanted to be here. Randy had refused. What was about to happen wasn't something he wanted her to witness, but she'd insisted on listening, on hearing Tony's confession, on knowing that justice was being served. Randy texted back, "Trust me, this ends tonight." At 7:58, the doorbell rang. Showtime. Tony arrived first, fashionably early, carrying a bottle of wine worth more than the invitation cardstock. "Randy." He embraced Randy like a brother, all warmth and affection. "I'm glad you called. After our last conversation, I was worried." "Water under the bridge," Randy said smoothly, accepting the wine. "We've been friends too long to let misunderstandings damage what we've built." Tony's smile was relieved, genuine. He thought he'd won, thought Randy had backed down, had decided the evidence was too circumstantial, the accusations too serious to pursue without absolute proof. He had no idea he was walking into a tomb. Marco and Vincent arrived together at 8:03, both nervous but hiding it behind professional courtesy. They'd dressed well, expensive suits, the armor of legitimate businessmen. But Randy saw the tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes catalogued exits. They knew something was wrong, but they came anyway, because not coming would have been an admission of guilt. Luca arrived last, at 8:07, looking like a man being led to execution. His hands trembled when he shook Randy's hand, his smile more grimace than greeting. "Thank you for coming," Randy said to each of them, his tone warm, welcoming. "It means a lot. Please, sit." They arranged themselves around the table. Tony at Randy's right hand, as always, Marco and Vincent across from each other, Luca at the far end, as far from Randy as the seating allowed. Randy remained standing at the head of the table, surveying his guests with the benevolent smile of a host who'd spared no expense for his friends. "Gentlemen," he began, lifting his wine glass, "thank you for joining me tonight. I know things have been complicated recently. Tensions have been high. Misunderstandings have created friction where there should only be trust." He paused, letting the words settle. "But we've built something remarkable together. An empire that spans both worlds, the one we came from and the one we've created. That's worth preserving." Tony raised his glass, nodding. "Absolutely." "To the Empire." "To the Empire," the others echoed, glasses raised. Randy smiled. "Actually, I'd like to propose a different toast." He set down his glass, reaching into his jacket pocket. "To loyalty, to trust, to the bonds that hold organizations together even when tested by adversity." He pulled out a small remote control, pressed a button. The dining room's hidden speaker system came to life with a soft hiss of static. Then Debbie's voice filled the room. "I don't know if I'm being paranoid. Randy says I'm safe, but something feels wrong." Randy watched the color drain from Tony's face, watched Marco's hand freeze halfway to his mouth, watched Vincent's eyes go wide with recognition, and Luca's entire body start trembling. "Tony brought my medication today. New bottles. He said Dr. Morrison changed the prescription." "Randy," Tony started, his voice tight. Randy held up a hand, silencing him. "Please, let's listen together." The recording continued. Debbie's observations, her fears, her growing confusion as the poisoning took hold. Then Tony's voice joined hers. "The medication schedule changes tonight. Double the dosage on the gabapentin, And stop bringing her solid food after tomorrow. Luca made a sound like a wounded animal. Tony's knuckles were white around his wine glass. She'll learn her place. The queen's blind and the king's gone. Guess who runs the palace now? Randy leaned back in his chair, watching his guests with the detached interest of a scientist observing a reaction. Tony's face had gone from pale to red, rage and panic warring for control. Marco and Vincent were frozen, trapped between the desire to run and the certainty that running would be an admission. The recording played on. Tony's cruelty, Luca's compliance, the systematic starvation, the psychological torture, the mocking of a blind woman who couldn't defend herself. Make her beg, Luca. It'll be fun to watch. Randy pressed another button. The speakers fell silent. That, Randy said quietly into the stunned silence, was recorded by my wife, in her own bedroom, in the house I built to keep her safe. He looked at each man in turn. The house where she was poisoned, starved, and humiliated by people I trusted to care for her. Tony found his voice first. Randy, you have to understand. This is taken out of context. What context makes make her beg acceptable? Randy's voice stayed level, almost conversational. What context justifies poisoning a blind woman for 18 months? What context makes stealing $14 million and replacing her medication with neurotoxins reasonable behavior? I can explain. You already did, on the recordings. Randy gestured at the speakers. 47 files, hours of documentation. Your voice, Tony, clear as crystal, admitting everything, laughing about it, enjoying it. Tony stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. I'm leaving. Frankie Vance materialized in the doorway, arms crossed. Marcus Stone appeared from the kitchen. Jimmy Woo emerged from the hallway. All three men were armed, not obviously, but Randy saw the telltale bulges, the careful positioning that meant weapons were within easy reach. Sit down, Tony. Randy's voice never rose, never hardened, just stayed perfectly, terrifyingly calm. We're not done yet. This is kidnapping. This is dinner, with friends, having an honest conversation about betrayal. Randy stood, moving around the table with slow, deliberate steps. You wanted to run the palace, Tony? Fine. Let's talk about palace politics, about what happens when the consigliere forgets his place, about what happens when you hurt the queen and think the king won't notice. Tony's hand moved toward his jacket. Reflex, panic, the instinct of a man who'd lived in Randy's world long enough to know how these situations ended. Randy's gun was out first, not pointed at Tony, just held casually, resting on the table beside his wine glass. Don't, Randy said softly. We're having a civilized dinner. Let's keep it civilized. Tony's hand froze. Slowly, carefully, he pulled it away from his jacket and placed both hands flat on the table. Good. Randy returned to his seat. Now where were we? Oh yes, the recordings. I have 47 of them, but there's one I particularly want to share with everyone. He pressed another button. Debbie's voice, praying, God, I don't know if you're listening. Please bring Randy home. I need him to be the ghost again. Just this once, just long enough to make them stop. The sound of her crying filled the elegant dining room, each sob a small knife in the silence. Randy let it play all the way through. Let them hear his wife, blind, starving, tortured, praying for her husband to become a monster because monsters were all that could save her. When it finished, Randy looked at Tony. She prayed for the ghost of Harlem, Randy said quietly. The thing I buried for her. The thing I swore I'd never be again. She prayed for it. Because you made her so desperate, so broken, that only a ghost could save her. Tony said nothing. What was there to say? Randy leaned back, picked up his wine glass, took a slow sip. You made her crawl for water, he said, voice soft and cold. You poisoned her medicine. You stole her money. You mocked her suffering. He set down the glass with careful precision. And you documented all of it, because you were arrogant enough to think I'd never find out, or stupid enough to think I couldn't prove it, or cruel enough not to care. Randy, please, this from Marco, his voice breaking. We didn't know. Tony said you'd authorized. You ate prime rib 10 feet from where my blind wife was starving, Randy interrupted. You drank champagne while she crawled for water. You laughed. His eyes went cold. So don't tell me you didn't know, Vincent tried next. We can make this right. Return the money. Cooperate with authorities. Whatever you need. What I need, Randy said, is for everyone in my world to understand what happens when you betray the ghost of Harlem. What happens when you hurt what belongs to him? What happens when you mistake mercy for weakness? He pulled out his phone, opened an app, turned the screen toward Tony. Do you recognize this? Randy asked. Tony's face went gray. On the screen, a live stream. The same dinner, filmed from multiple angles, being broadcast to a private network. That's our entire criminal infrastructure, Randy explained conversationally. Every associate, every partner, every person who's done business with us over the past 20 years, they're all watching right now, all hearing the recordings, all seeing you, my most trusted advisor, confess to poisoning my wife, stealing from her trust fund, and attempting to seize control of my organization through fraud and manipulation. No. Tony lunged for the phone, but Frankie was faster, pinning him back into his chair. Randy stood, walking to the window overlooking the sound. Dawn was breaking, gold and red, beautiful and terrible, the kind of sunrise that promised new beginnings and final endings. You wanted to run the palace, Randy said without turning around. Congratulations, Tony. For exactly 18 minutes you succeeded. But now? He looked back over his shoulder. Now everyone knows what you are. A thief, a torturer, a betrayer. And in our world, in the world you helped me build, there's no coming back from that. He turned to Frankie. How many messages have we received? Frankie checked his phone. 47, boss, all confirming they've seen the broadcast, all expressing their support for whatever you decide to do next. Randy nodded slowly. And the police? Have they arrived yet? On cue, sirens began wailing in the distance, growing closer. Right on schedule, Randy said. Anonymous tip about financial fraud, medical malpractice, and attempted murder, complete with evidence packages delivered to the DA's office, the FBI, and the State Medical Board. He smiled at Tony. You're not just done in my world, Tony. You're done everywhere. Tony looked at him with something like disbelief. You're turning me in? After everything we've been through? You're going to let them— I promised Debbie I'd left violence behind, Randy interrupted. That I'd become someone worthy of her love, someone who solved problems through legitimate channels. So that's what I'm doing. He walked back to the table, standing directly in front of Tony. The police will arrest you, prosecutors will charge you, courts will convict you, and you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, knowing that everyone, every single person in both our worlds, knows you betrayed the ghost of Harlem and lived to face consequences worse than death. Worse than— Tony's laugh was hollow, broken. Prison's worse than death? Prison's where you spend decades remembering what you lost, Randy said quietly. Where every day, you wake up knowing you had an empire and threw it away because you couldn't resist torturing a blind woman. Where every night you go to sleep knowing the ghost of Harlem let you live. Not out of mercy, but because killing you would have been too kind. The sirens were louder now, seconds away. Randy leaned down, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You hurt the only person who made me human, Tony. The only person I ever truly loved. And you laughed about it. Enjoyed it. Made it into entertainment. He straightened. So now you get to live knowing everyone else knows it too. That's your punishment. Not death, not mercy. Just truth. broadcast to everyone who matters, destroying everything you tried to build on my wife's suffering. Red and blue lights flooded the windows. Car doors slammed. Footsteps on the driveway. Randy walked to his seat, sat down calmly, and took another sip of wine. "Gentlemen," he said to Marco, Vincent, and Luca, who all looked like they were considering jumping through the windows, "I'd stay seated if I were you. Running would just make this harder." The front door burst open. Federal agents, guns drawn, shouting commands. Randy raised his hands calmly, setting down his wine glass. "Officers, thank you for coming. I'm Randy Sawyer. I'm the one who called. These 4 men are responsible for the medical fraud, theft, and attempted murder outlined in the evidence packages you received." Tony stared at him, expression shifting from disbelief to rage to something like grudging respect. "You planned this whole thing," Tony said as agents pulled him from his chair, cuffing his hands behind his back. "The dinner, the recordings, the broadcast, you wanted everyone to see." "I wanted everyone to know," Randy corrected, "in our world and in theirs, that you don't hurt what belongs to the ghost of Harlem. Ever." As agents led Tony toward the door, he looked back one last time. "You're making a mistake, Randy. Crossing that line again, becoming the ghost, you'll never come back from it." Randy picked up his wine glass, studying the red liquid in the candlelight. "I know," he said quietly, "but Debbie's worth it." Tony was gone. The agents swept through, collecting evidence, taking statements, transforming Randy's elegant dining room into a crime scene. Randy sat alone at the head of the table, surrounded by crystal and candles and the ruins of a friendship that had been rotting for longer than he'd wanted to admit. His phone buzzed. Debbie's text. "Is it over?" Randy typed back, "It's over. You're safe now. That's all that matters." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "What did it cost you?" Randy looked at his reflection in the dark window, saw the ghost of Harlem staring back. Not the man who'd tried to retire, but the thing he'd always been underneath the suits and the legitimate businesses. He typed, "Everything. And nothing. I'll explain when you're home." But he knew the truth. It had cost him exactly what Tony predicted. The man Debbie had fallen in love with, the one trying to be better, to be worthy, to be something more than violence, had died tonight. What remained was the ghost. And ghosts, Randy had learned, never really stop haunting. They just change what they're haunting for. The federal agents had been efficient, cuffing Marco and Vincent, securing Luca, reading rights with practiced monotony. But when they reached for Tony DeLuca, Randy raised a hand. "Give us a moment," Randy said quietly. "Please." The lead agent, a woman named Chen who'd worked with Randy on previous cases when he was cooperating with federal investigations, hesitated. "Mr. Sawyer, we can't—" "2 minutes." Randy's voice stayed calm, but something in his eyes made Agent Chen step back. "He's not going anywhere. I promise." She nodded reluctantly, gesturing her team toward the door. 2 minutes. We'll be right outside." The room emptied except for Randy, Tony, and Frankie Vance standing silent guard by the doorway. Tony rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had been temporarily removed, his eyes tracking Randy's every movement. They'd known each other 18 years, long enough to read each other's tells, long enough to know when violence was coming. "So this is it?" Tony asked, voice tight. "You humiliate me in front of everyone, broadcast my mistakes to the entire network, and now you hand me to the feds?" He laughed, hollow, bitter. "I thought the ghost of Harlem had more style." "Style would be putting a bullet in your head," Randy said quietly. He remained seated, hands folded calmly on the table. "But I promised my wife I'd left that life behind." "Promises." Tony spat the word. "You want to talk about promises? What about the promise you made to me? That we'd build something together? That loyalty would be rewarded? I spent 18 years making you rich, Randy, making you legitimate. And this is how you repay me? You poisoned Debbie. I repositioned assets. Randy's hand slammed on the table hard enough to make the crystal jump. You poisoned my wife. Each word came out precise, controlled, but edged with something cold and deadly. Don't dress it up in business language. You fed her neurotoxins, destroyed her sight, made her crawl for water while you laughed in my house. Tony's face twisted. She was in the way, don't you understand? You were going soft, Randy. Playing house, playing businessman, forgetting what it took to build this empire. Someone had to make the hard decisions. The hard decision to torture a blind woman? The strategic decision to secure our future. Tony stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. You were weak, distracted. Debbie made you vulnerable, and in our world, vulnerable means dead. His hand moved toward his jacket, the same instinctive reach that had gotten men killed for decades in their business. So I did what you couldn't. I removed the weakness. Randy saw it coming, saw Tony's fingers close around the concealed pistol he'd smuggled past the metal detectors by knowing exactly where Randy's security blind spots were. Saw the gun start to clear the holster. Randy moved. 18 years ago, Tony had been faster, stronger, more dangerous. But 18 years of thinking he'd won, of believing Randy had gone soft, of celebrating too early, it had made him slow. Randy closed the distance in 2 steps, his hand catching Tony's wrist mid-draw. A twist, taught to him by a Krav Maga instructor who'd owed him a favor decades ago, and the gun clattered to the floor. Randy spun Tony around, slamming him face down on the dining table hard enough to scatter crystal and silverware. One hand pinned Tony's wrist behind his back, the other pressed his face into the mahogany. 18 years, Randy said quietly, his mouth close to Tony's ear. I taught you everything, how to fight, how to survive, how to build an empire from nothing. He applied pressure, feeling Tony's shoulder joint strain. But I never taught you the most important lesson. What lesson? Tony gasped, face pressed into expensive wood. You never hurt what the ghost loves. Randy reached for the gun on the floor, picked it up smoothly, and pressed the barrel against the base of Tony's skull. Outside, sirens wailed. Red and blue lights painted the walls through the windows. Agents were shouting, probably hearing the commotion, probably seconds from bursting through the door. But in this moment, it was just 2 men, one clinging to greed, one clinging to love. Randy, please, Tony's voice cracked, fear finally breaking through the bravado. Please, I'm sorry. I made mistakes. I can fix this. I'll return the money. All of it. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. Just don't. Don't what? Randy's finger rested on the trigger. Don't do what you would have done to me, what you were planning to do once you had Debbie declared incompetent? I wouldn't have killed you. You would have erased me, made me irrelevant, taken everything I built and put your name on it. Randy's voice stayed perfectly level. But the real crime, Tony? The one I can't forgive? You hurt her. The only person who made me human. The only person who saw the monster I was and loved me anyway. You hurt her, and you enjoyed it. His finger tightened on the trigger. Randy. Wait, we can make a deal. I have offshore accounts. $50 million. It's yours. Just let me. You think I want your money? Randy's laugh was soft, terrible. You think this is about profit? Tony, you fundamentally misunderstood what happened tonight. This isn't business. This is personal. The barrel pressed harder against Tony's skull. Randy, please! Randy's phone buzzed in his pocket. The private line, the one only Debbie had access to. He pulled it out with his free hand, keeping the gun steady. Debbie's voice, tired but clear. Randy, I know what you're about to do. Randy said nothing, just breathed, just felt the weight of the gun, just calculated how easy it would be to pull the trigger and end this. I can hear it in your voice, Debbie continued. when you're about to cross a line you can't come back from. I've heard it before. Years ago, before you promised to change. A pause. Randy, if you kill him, you become what he said you were. Weak because you loved me. Distracted. Unable to lead because I made you soft. He hurt you. He tried to break me. But I'm not broken, Randy. I'm here. I'm safe. And I'm asking you, begging you, to keep your promise. Her voice strengthened. You promised me peace, not revenge, not blood, peace. So keep it, please, for me. Randy stood frozen, the gun pressed against Tony's skull, his finger on the trigger, every instinct screaming to pull it. To end this permanently. To make sure Tony never hurt anyone again. To show the world what happened when you touched what belonged to the ghost. Randy, Debbie whispered, come back to me. Not as the ghost, as the man I fell in love with. The one who promised to be better. Randy's hand trembled. He doesn't deserve mercy. No, he doesn't. But you deserve peace. So do I. She paused. Let the law have him. Let them take everything from him the way he tried to take everything from me. Let him spend the rest of his life knowing he failed. That's worse than death, Randy. That's justice. Randy stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably seconds. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. You're lucky, Randy said quietly to Tony. Lucky that the woman you tried to destroy is better than both of us. He stepped back, letting Tony up. The consigliere's face was tear-streaked, pathetic. Nothing remained of the confident man who'd walked through Randy's door an hour ago. Randy walked to the door, opened it. Agent Chen stood ready, her team behind her. He's all yours, Randy said. Evidence is in the folders on the table. Bank records, medical fraud documentation, audio recordings, everything you need. Agents flooded in, recuffing Tony properly this time, reading him his rights, explaining charges that would put him away for decades. Tony looked at Randy one last time as they led him to the door. You should have killed me. I know, Randy said. But I promised her peace, and unlike you, I keep my promises. As the federal convoy pulled away, taking Tony, Marco, Vincent, and Luca toward arraignment and prosecution, and the systematic destruction of everything they'd built on Debbie's suffering, Randy stood on his front steps watching. Frankie approached quietly. It's done, boss. Every account frozen, every asset seized. The DA says with the evidence we provided, they're looking at minimum 30 years each. And the money? 14 million recovered from Tony's offshore accounts. I've already started the paperwork to redirect it to the foundation. Frankie paused. Debbie Sawyer Foundation for the Blind. Medical research, victim support, advocacy. She'll be able to help thousands. Randy nodded slowly. Good. That's good. Boss? Frankie's voice was careful. You okay? Randy looked at his hands. They weren't shaking, weren't trembling, just steady, controlled. The hands of a man who'd almost killed his oldest friend and chosen mercy instead. I don't know, Randy said honestly. Ask me again when Debbie comes home. He walked back inside, closed the door on the sirens and the lights and the ruins of the empire he'd built. His phone buzzed. Debbie. Thank you. Randy typed back. For what? For choosing me, for keeping your promise, for being the man I fell in love with instead of the ghost everyone fears. Randy stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed, always, no matter what it costs. But standing alone in his dining room, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal and the aftermath of justice, Randy wondered if that was true, if he'd really chosen peace over vengeance, or if he'd just changed the shape of his revenge to match Debbie's mercy. Either way, Tony DeLuca was gone. The threat was ended. Debbie was safe. And the ghost of Harlem? The ghost was learning that sometimes the hardest battles weren't the ones you won with bullets. They were the ones you won by putting the gun down. 8 months after that terrible Friday morning, Debbie stood in a private clinic in Zurich, watching shapes slowly materialize from the fog that had been her world. Not full vision. Dr. Weber had been clear about that. The experimental stem cell treatment could only restore perhaps 30% of what she'd lost. Shadows would become shapes. Darkness would become gray. The world would never be crisp and clear again. But 30% was a miracle she'd stopped believing in. Randy had arranged everything: the clinic, the specialists, the experimental treatment that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. He'd flown with her to Switzerland, held her hand through every procedure, read to her every night in their temporary apartment overlooking Lake Zurich. But something in him had changed. Something fundamental had broken the night he came home to find her crawling for water. She felt it in the way he touched her now. Gentle, protective, but distant. Like she was something precious he was holding for someone else. Like he was already saying goodbye. "Randy?" she'd asked one night, her fingers finding his face in the darkness of their Swiss apartment. "What did you do to them?" His silence had been answer enough. Tony DeLuca's body was never found. Neither were Marco's or Vincent's. Luca, the nurse, simply vanished from every database, every record, like he'd never existed at all. Angela DeLuca received an envelope with travel documents and a 7-figure wire transfer, along with a single typed sentence: "Leave the country, never come back." The ghost of Harlem had kept his promise. He'd resolved things the old way. Randy never confirmed anything, never denied anything, just kept reading to her in the evenings, his voice steady and warm, like nothing had happened except a few business associates moving away for unrelated reasons. But Debbie knew. She'd always known what Randy was capable of. It was why she'd made him promise to leave that life behind, why she'd believed he could become someone different. She'd been wrong about that. You couldn't unmake what you were. You could only choose when to remember it. The foundation opened 6 months after they returned from Switzerland. The Lighthouse Initiative: sanctuary and support for blind individuals and abuse survivors. A converted mansion in Connecticut with state-of-the-art accessibility features, counseling services, legal aid, job training programs. Everything Debbie had desperately needed during her darkest months, now available to others who found themselves vulnerable and alone. Funded anonymously through a maze of shell corporations and charitable trusts that no forensic accountant could trace back to Randy Sawyer. $7 million to start. More promised as needed. Debbie threw herself into the work with fierce purpose. Her partial vision made her awkward at first, misjudging distances, stumbling over obstacles her brain insisted shouldn't be there. But she learned, adapted, became the foundation's beating heart. She never asked about the funding source. Some truths were easier left unspoken. Randy attended the opening gala, his last public appearance. He stood in the shadows at the back of the ballroom, watching Debbie give her speech about hope and survival and the strength of vulnerable communities, watching her shine the way she used to before darkness came. She couldn't see him clearly from the stage, but she knew he was there. She always knew. After the gala, after the donors left and the staff went home, Debbie found Randy on the foundation's back terrace. He was staring at the gardens he'd personally designed to be navigable by touch and sound: textured pathways, wind chimes marking intersections, fragrant plants indicating directions. "You're leaving," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. She'd felt it building for months, the way he'd been organizing things, transferring properties, selling businesses, saying goodbye to the life he'd built without actually saying the words. Randy didn't turn around. "Sawyer Holdings sold last week. The lawyers finalized everything Tuesday. You'll never want for anything, Debbie. The trusts are ironclad, the foundation's endowed for 100 years. I don't care about the money." She moved closer, her recovering vision painting him in soft grays and shadows against the twilight. I care about you. I know. His voice was rough, strained. That's why I have to go. Because of what you did to them? Because of what I enjoyed doing to them? The confession hung between them like smoke. Debbie's hand found his shoulder. She turned him gently, her fingers rising to trace his face the way she'd learned during the blind months. Reading him through touch, seeing him more clearly than her damaged eyes ever could. You protected me, she whispered. That's not something to be ashamed of. I didn't just protect you, Debbie. Randy's hands covered hers, holding them against his face. I erased them, methodically, patiently, and I felt nothing but satisfaction while I did it. That's not the man you fell in love with. That's not the man you made me promise to become. Maybe he's both. Her thumbs brushed his cheekbones, feeling the tension there. Maybe you're both men, and I loved you anyway. Past tense? Present tense. She smiled sadly. I'll always love you, Randy. But I understand why you need to leave. You didn't bring peace to our life. You just changed the name of the war. Randy's laugh was quiet, broken. Maybe, but you're safe now. That's enough. He kissed her forehead, gentle, final, and stepped back from her touch. The Foundation will send monthly reports, he said. You'll never see me, but I'll always be watching. If you ever need anything. I know. Debbie's vision blurred with tears, though she couldn't tell if they were falling or if her damaged eyes were just playing tricks again. I know you'll be there. Randy walked away without looking back. Through the gardens he'd designed, past the gates he'd installed, into the quiet street where a car waited with darkened windows. Debbie stood on the terrace long after his footsteps faded. Stood there as the sun set, and the wind chimes sang their gentle directions. Stood there as darkness came again, though this time it was natural, temporary, survivable. She raised her face to the last rays of sunlight, feeling warmth flicker across her recovering vision. Shapes and shadows dancing at the edge of perception. Not full sight, but enough. Enough to see that the world was still there, still turning, still beautiful despite everything. In the distance, she heard a car engine fade into traffic. The ghost of Harlem had disappeared again. This time by choice. This time on his own terms. And Debbie, survivor, advocate, woman who'd learned to navigate darkness and find her own light, turned back toward the Foundation's glowing windows, where people who understood loss waited to be helped by someone who'd survived it. Behind her, the street lay empty. The ghost was gone, but his protection remained, always watching, always there, forever haunting the edges of the world he'd destroyed and rebuilt in her name. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as you can ever imagine.